Okay, well, here we go. Aloha, everyone, and welcome to a special presentation hosted by Maui Nui Marine Resource Council on purifying Kihei's wastewater and green infrastructure as an alternative to injection wells. We're very excited that you're here. I'm Darla Palmer Ellingson, your MC, and I'm also the producer and host of the public affairs radio program Island Environment 360, Maui's only commercially broadcast public affairs show dedicated to environmental and related Hawaiian cultural topics and aired on the stations of H Hawaii Media. Tonight's presentation is part of Maui Nui Marine Resource Council's monthly Know Your Ocean Speaker Series, which is usually held on the first Wednesday of each month at 5:30 p.m. via Zoom. This monthly series is supported by the County of Maui Mayor's Office of Economic Development. And a few things before we get going here. You'll notice your microphone is on mute. Please do keep it on mute during the presentation to avoid distractions. But we do invite you to submit questions by using the Q&A button on the lower edge of your screen. And if you don't see it, if you just scroll your mouse over the Zoom screen, you can see that function pop up. And we'll leave time at the end too for to answer your questions after the presentation. And now it's my pleasure to introduce our presenters, Paul Sturm and John Astilla. Paul Sturm is the founder and executive director of the nonprofit organization Ridge to Reefs. Founded in 2011, Ridge to Reefs works to protect and restore coastal and coral reef ecosystems by reducing land to sea pollution with green infrastructure. Their expertise includes treating polluted storm and wastewater by establishing green infrastructure solutions such as constructed wetlands, rain gardens, and bioreactors. Ridge to Reefs currently has projects in Chesapeake Bay, Hawaii, Puerto Rico, Palau, and American Samoa. Paul has spent over 25 years working on watershed plans, implementation projects, and code changes in the Chesapeake Bay watershed and around the country. Early in his career, he spent 6 years researching the effectiveness of implementation of agricultural and urban best management practices and developed methods to track and target pollution source areas in coastal and agricultural watersheds. He has contributed to more than 20 publications and has presented more than 60 lectures around the US, Canada, and the Caribbean. John Astilla is the owner of Sunshine Vetiver Solutions in Kihei, a local business that produces vetiver grass and provides planning services for vetiver projects. He was introduced to vetiver while working as a conservation specialist for Maui Soil and Water Conservation District at the USDA Natural Resources Conservation Service Kahului Field Office. John is certified through the Vetiver through the Vetiver Network International, sorry about that, as a quality producer of vetiver grass and has utilized vetiver throughout Maui to reduce erosion, manage water flow, stabilize steep slopes, and trap sediment. We'll hear from Paul first and then John. So please join me in welcoming them both to the Zoom stage.
Thank you.
Yeah, I see Paul coming online there. So Paul, I'm just going to turn it over to you and to start your presentation.
Okay, thank you. I will share my screen and let's see. All right. All right, so thank you for that introduction, Darla, and thank you for the opportunity to be here and present, and the forum for both John and I to present some of the things that we've been working on together. And really, I've been working with John for probably over 6 or 7 years, starting in West Maui and working on ways to trap sediment, keeping it from coming off some of the kind of abandoned agricultural lands that are over there in West Maui, and working also with West Maui Ridge to Reefs, or Ridge to Reef as a partner. And so I guess we've been thinking about this problem for a while because of how important it is, and its potential impact and its past impact on the coastal waters. And so anyway, I think I'll start with, I think that we tried to come up with nature-based ways to deal with the additional effluent that's being generated essentially at 3 wastewater plants in Maui. And we came up with this idea to do a reuse project. And John's had this idea for a long time. And I think we were finally able to kind of work together and write a proposal and start looking at these solutions, and really start looking at them close to the wastewater treatment plant, where they would actually be built. So we've built similar types of projects in other places, but having a pilot happen right there in Kihei, I think, is really important. So with that, I will start my presentation. Just a little background here, the Ridge to Reefs team for this project. We have an agronomist on staff, we have engineers on staff. Our agronomist is Val Mantha and Kelly Harris. And then Albert McCullough is an engineer, as is Kelly. And they've been involved in a lot of these types of projects around the world, particularly in the Chesapeake Bay and Puerto Rico and some of the other places that we've been working. Our collaborators include John Astilla. You see there, he's there with a vetiver grass, and you can see the extensive root system that was grown in a pipe. It just shows that they can grow up to 8 to 12 feet into the ground. As well as Maui Nui Resource Council and Maui College will be assisting with some of the monitoring and the monitoring analysis. Just a little background on Ridge to Reefs. We're really historically focused on a watershed-based approach, and really looking at the way water moves throughout the watershed and looking for appropriate places to intervene and improve the quality of that water. And often, our work involves visioning and involving the community in these types of decisions. And you can see some of the projects we've done. You see that project, Guanica 1929. That was a wastewater project that we did for a hotel in Puerto Rico. And then some of the projects below here are stormwater projects where we're using green infrastructure. You can see in this picture here, you had a lot of sediment runoff and a lot of sediment moving out to the reefs, the adjacent reefs. So essentially just coming up with nature-based solutions, and nature has solved all these problems historically, and has provisioned clean water for us for thousands of years. And so I think we really look to Mother Nature for guidance on reducing pollution. This is an example of a project that our team has worked on, and including John, and we were talking with folks from University of Hawaii about some of the challenges associated with cesspools. So again, we tried to come up with a nature-based solution, and this solution being tested at one of the treatment plants in Oahu with University of Hawaii. And so far, it's removing around 78% of the nitrogen that comes into it. And then in terms of the context, Maui County wastewater reclamation has an increasing amount of wastewater and R1 water that it's generating, particularly as tourism has increased more recently. So, and again, that water historically has been injected into the ground, and historically, some of the concentrations have been too high or have impacted coral reefs. I do want to point out that Maui County has done an amazing job of doing very well in terms of um, improving the quality of that water. Um, and so almost to state of the art, but even state of the art for nitrogen is around 2 milligrams per liter, which is at least 2,000 times higher than a coral reef would need, maybe even 20,000 times higher than what's a safe number for coral reefs. So it just goes to show we really have to try to get closer to zero when it comes to these systems. That's why we really like the idea of an evapotranspirative system like John is going to talk about, and really minimize the amount of effluent that's even making its way to the reef. So that's really one of our goals. And so we're going to talk about several ways to get there. We're going to talk about 3 different ways to get there. And the benefit of nature-based practices are they're low cost, low maintenance, they sequester large amounts of carbon, they use very little energy. Treatment plants are some of the most energy, are very energy intensive, but the solutions that we like to come up with require very little energy, and they can be implemented very quickly. So in this talk, we're going to talk about those 3 options that will be beneficial to coral reefs and compliance with regulations. And again, John's going to talk about reuse via land application using restoration in native plants, efficient at evapotranspiration and nutrient removal. I'm going to talk about treatment using a bioreactor and natural filtration technology to clean water so that it approaches drinking water standards and increases the disposal properties, to include food production and even potentially re-injection if we can get that water to a clean enough standard. Again, part of the idea is just to provide options. And then the third thing, we're going to talk about something called an SAT basin, and we've kind of modified that practice to improve its performance for water quality. And it uses evaporation, evapotranspiration to improve the water before it goes into the groundwater kind of slowly and passively. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to John, and he's going to talk about reuse via land application.
Hello, thank you, Paul, for that intro. Hello, everyone. Welcome, and thank you for coming to this talk series tonight. So I'll get into it. The reuse via land application. This is a project site that we have in Kihei where we're utilizing Vetiver grass as a means to reuse the county's wastewater. And just to give you some historical context on Vitavir, it's a perennial bunch grass, which has an extensive root system that can reach depths of 10 foot plus. It has very fast growth, and it has a really unique ability to convert nutrients such as nitrogen and phosphorus that's in wastewater and use that to create explosive growth and biomass. Vitavir was originally brought into the Hawaii in, I'd say, the early 80s by the Plant Materials Center on Molokai. And they tested the grass for 20 some years, and they were testing it for its potential invasiveness and its potential use as a conservation tool. And over that 2 decades of testing, they determined that the grass is sterile and has a really, really low risk of becoming invasive. And they found with such an extensive root system that Vetiver grass was an ideal candidate to use as a conservation tool, especially on highly erodible lands and steep slopes. The grass is pretty tolerant of very extreme conditions. And because of that, it also made an ideal candidate for treating wastewater. Okay. Okay. You can move on to the next slide, Paul. So here's just a little bit of history on vetiver grass here in Hawaii. It's been mainly used for erosion control. These are some pictures of work that Paul and I had done in West Maui. And these were basically erosion control projects that help minimize and reduce sediment flowing into Honokawai and Wahikuli streams. And we found in just a short period of time, a lot of these vetiver sites have trapped tremendous amounts of sediment. And that was the main usage so far. And we're testing out this new application of vetiver in Hawaii to treat wastewater. It's been done in other parts of the world, but I think this is a first time for Hawaii. And this application of Vetiver for wastewater was first pioneered by Dr. Paul Trong. He's a research scientist from Australia. And he had really great success in using this low-cost alternative in treating wastewater. And that's what we're trying to attempt here to see if we can replicate some of that success in Australia. You can move to the next slide. Okay, and so this chart, I just wanted to point out, unlike other grasses, vetiver doesn't have a cessation period. So year-round, vetiver grass has a high water use rate, even in highly saturated conditions, and it has explosive biomass and above-ground growth. And this happens year-round, unlike other grasses, which tend to go through cessation or reduction in biomass production. And when that's happening, it's not consuming water, it's not consuming nutrients, but vetiver grass will do that year-round. And for our growing conditions here in Hawaii, it's another characteristic which makes it really ideal in treating wastewater coming from the recycled water plant. Okay. This is just an example of some of the work that Dr. Trong had done in Australia. This was a pilot project showing how vetiver can treat primary screened sewage. So, the sewage goes into the wastewater facility, all the solids are removed, and the effluent was then pumped into a field with vetiver grass. And if you could see from some of the numbers they were showing, prior to vetiver treatment, the nitrogen totals were 68 milligrams per liter. Phosphorus was 10.6 milligrams per liter, and fecal coliform was above 8,000 units. And the outflow, once tested, you can see a significant drop in the nitrogen to 0.13 milligrams per liter. Phosphorus was reduced to 0.152 milligrams per liter, and fecal coliform was less than 10 units. So you can see that vetiver is truly unique in that it can quickly reduce the amount of nutrients. And another benefit with such dense root system, it has the ability to bind heavy metals and pharmaceuticals that other filtration processes might miss. Okay, and this is our Kihei project site. So we are using this as a land disposal area. We have a combination of both drip irrigations and sprinklers. Having these two units of irrigation allows us to quickly ramp up the amount of water that can be applied to the reuse site. Or if demand is high from other recycled users, we can scale down quickly and just use drip. But if there are times where there's an excess of recycled water, we can fire up the sprinklers and increase the evaporation of the R1 water, and the grass helps increase the evapotranspiration of the water. Compared to other alternatives, this is a relatively low cost one to implement. And another benefit is that it can be quickly developed and created, and and we can quickly ramp up, water reuse really quickly with this method. You can see in this picture, like the grass on the left is 3 months old and the grass on the right is 2. And within that time period, we have been able to apply quite a bit of volume. The project site is maybe 15,000 square feet, and we're averaging about 3,000 to 4,000 gallons a day of reuse. And it equates to roughly 140,000 gallons per month for such a small site. And we're just getting started. The plants are only 2 to 3 months old, and already they're consuming and using up, the high end of the modeling that we had done. So by the time this grass matures, we're hoping to double or triple that amount of water that can be reused on this small site. Another thing that we're trying to do with this project is, validate a report that was created for the Department of Environmental Management back in 2018 by Brown and Caldwell. And in this report, they identified land application as the best alternative to reach the 100% reuse goal of recycled water. So this project will serve to validate that recommendation, but we hope to take it further and show that that this site and this grass and this technique of disposal and reuse can surpass the volumes that they had originally placed in their study using Bermuda grass. And we hope to really outperform those numbers that they had presented in that study.
Hey, John, do you mind if I ask, we had a question come in about the site, and I know you showed the overhead map, but where in Kihei actually is the project site located?
It's adjacent to the wastewater reclamation facility.
Okay, great.
Yeah, and just one on a last note, this green infrastructure, like I said, is low cost. It could be quickly established, and it'd be a great alternative to help the county reach their goal of 100% reuse. And I think there's really good potential for this to, rid the R1 water of a lot of nutrients before they get to the reef and improve coastal water quality. Okay. And if there's no other questions, I think I'm going to pass it on to Paul, and he'll talk about the bioreactor and the SAT basin.
Actually, we did have a couple of questions come in about that.
Okay.
Do you have any estimate of how big of an area would be required to handle 1 million gallons per day currently injected?
Well, so right now, the Brown and Caldwell study estimated for the current conditions at the Kihei facility that they would need 140 acres of Bermuda grass to completely reuse 100% of the R1 water. We're hoping to reduce that number, and just looking at the modeling that we did, we're expecting at least 20 to 30,000 gallons per acre. So at that volume, to meet the county's current usage, it's just a little under 100 acres that we would need to dispose of the current excess. For future build out, the Brown and Caldwell study, ultimately called for 380 acres to meet South Maui's future needs. And there again, once we get the real-time data for how this project performs in Kihei, we hope to come up with a better and more accurate estimate of the land area that's needed. And another thing to consider is that, these reuse sites doesn't have to be one block of land. It doesn't have to be a contiguous 140 acres. This concept can be decentralized. We could, locate areas along the current recycled water distribution line that might benefit from, erosion control. So in that scenario, we could couple a reuse site with an erosion control site, essentially feeding 2 birds with 1 seed. And that'd be an even quicker way to ramp up the county's reuse, as well as preventing land-based pollutants from entering our waterways and reaching the coast.
So on that note, a couple of people have asked, how does the water get to the reuse part of it? So it goes in the ground, there's an extensive root system, and then how does that water get to the point of reuse?
Well, the plant is a really hungry plant. And even under highly saturated conditions, the plant uptakes that water fairly quickly through evapotranspiration. And it converts it into biomass growth, which helps sequester carbon. So that's the reuse part of the concept.
I see. And then how long does the vetiver grass live for?
It's fairly long lived. I know there's records of vetiver being planted in Samoa that are over 150 years old.
Wow.
It's a very long lived grass. I know here on Maui, the oldest stands I've seen have been planted about 2002. And if you go to the Molokai Plant Material Center, they have the original vetiver they planted in the early 80s, and it's still standing tall.
Okay. So we have a question. Can you explain why you need to add water via sprinklers or drip irrigation? I thought this project was supposed to handle wastewater for reuse and filter stormwater to remove sediment.
Paul will talk more about that, but
Okay.
we use both the drip and the overhead irrigation just to give us the flexibility, for irrigating the field. If we wanted to, there is an excess amount of R1 water, we can quickly ramp up reuse by incorporating the overhead sprinklers and really use up a lot of volume in a short period of time. But if that excess amount isn't too high, then we could just switch to the drip irrigation and apply it at a slower rate. And that allows, just some flexibility. If there's a high peak demand for recycled water, then there's really no need to apply it to the Vetiver site. But if for some reason there isn't a high demand, then, it gives the county or whoever's managing this to really put out a lot of volume in a short period of time.
Okay, I'm just going to probably cut it off after one more question because we're getting a lot of questions in this topic area. We're going to save a few for the end. But somebody just jumped in and I lost my place here. Maybe they withdrew their question. So I'm going to go ahead and turn it back over to you guys to continue on, and we will get back to the grass questions at the end.
Sure. So I'll follow up on one of those questions. Is that right now, I guess some of the numbers I've seen have been up to say 4 million gallons a day that has to be injected at the Kihei site. I don't know exactly where that stands today, but I've heard numbers around 3 to 5 million gallons a day. And so part of our goal is to make that water, because that right now is not able to be reused through the current system. So part of our goal is to reuse that. And so anyway, and this is the way to do that and keep us from having to inject that water, which is a potential risk to the coral reefs because of there is some nitrogen. The county's done great at removing that, but there's also things like pharmaceutical byproducts and other things in there that could be harmful to the reefs over time. So, a little bit of a pharmaceutical compound might not hurt you or I, but think about a tiny organism like a coral, the coral polyps and things like that. There can be much more sensitive to even small amounts of things like pharmaceuticals. Let's see. So one of the second things that we're going to test here, and for example, some of what we've noticed in West Maui is that there's a real demand for water, particularly from farms. So the idea we had in this particular case is that, well, let's look at a technique, a nature-based technique that can remove nitrogen that can remove pharmaceutical compounds and other things that may be harmful. And so we've built a lot of these systems in other places. And then we've also built one in Oahu as well, or a very similar practice. But the idea here is that you create an environment that is good for denitrifying bacteria. You to create an anoxic environment. And so the way we do that is that we essentially fill a trench with wood chips. And then by putting water through that trench with wood chips at a certain rate, under anoxic conditions, the denitrifying bacteria are able to use the wood chips as a fuel source. And often we're able to source wood chips that are from invasive species. So again, we're feeding two birds with one seed, one of John's monikers, and that's really important. And so what we're able to do in a system like this is to remove a lot of those pollutants, and then we're also going to combine it with a second stage filter that would include sand and biochar. Essentially, if you think about like something like a Brita filter that you have in your refrigerator, that's essentially activated carbon, which is very similar to biochar. So what we're talking about is making a landscape or scale filter, using natural materials that are essentially byproducts of waste streams, and filtering that water, and then having that water that could then be reused for agriculture. As it is right now, I think some people are nervous about using R1 water for agriculture, particularly on things like lettuce and food crops that such as the ones behind my head there on the image. And I think that what we would like to see with the denitrifying bioreactor is treat that water almost to a drinking water standard using nature-based principles, and then have that available for agriculture and other uses. So this is an example of a project on the eastern shore of Maryland, taking runoff from farms that apply poultry manure to the land and have high amounts of losses of nitrogen. And so again, in this case, we're using wood chips and biochar together in one filter, and then getting very low concentrations of nitrate as well as other contaminants. We also built one of these, what we call a denitrification curtain. And this is locally made biochar from Ricky Apana. And essentially we created a trench. There's a lot of groundwater moving to this pond, and we measured it, and it was high in nutrients and probably had other chemicals in it as well from the management of the golf course. And we used wood chips and biochar, and the golf course actually helped us construct this practice. And we were showing over 50% removal of both nitrogen and phosphorus very quickly, after that was installed. So that just an example. And I think when we're able to size this type of project adequately, we've been able to consistently get very good water quality from those types of practices. Another practice that we're looking at, because the county talked about an SAT basin as potential option for disposal, well, in this case, it would really be disposal. It's not really reuse. But the idea with a modified SAT basin is to, the SAT basin itself doesn't necessarily have any vegetation or any sort of treatment associated with it, or minimal. And so what we've seen when we've looked at data from Arizona is that SAT basins still allow a fair amount of nutrients into the groundwater, especially nitrate. And so what we decided to do is let's figure if can we amp up an SAT basin by using vetiver and biochar, and actually filter and clean that water, lock up some of those pollutants before it's allowed to sort of start to pass into the groundwater. So again, we built some similar projects in Puerto Rico, again, using sand, biochar, vetiver grass, just using some of these nature-based solutions. And you can see what that project looks like as it matured. And this is actually treating a 27-room hotel in a relatively small area. And we're getting, during normal conditions when there's, it's not peak season during Christmas or something, we're not even seeing any discharge from this system because that vetiver grass is so thirsty. It's just taking up all that water. And then even when we do see discharge from the system, it's the water quality is greatly improved in terms of both a less volume and less concentration of pollutants. So some of the benefits of modified SAT basins that we see, it protects underlying groundwater, it performs evapotranspiration, water quality treatment, and of course, protects the aquifer. And again, just using locally available materials that are fairly easy to come by. So the next thing I'm going to talk about is just some of the monitoring. We're going to do monitoring associated with this project in Maui College, and we have some colleagues from UH that are also giving us advice on this project, as well as some local experts in irrigation and irrigation management systems. So we're going to determine the ability of vetiver grass on a square foot basis to uptake processed wastewater, both surface and subsurface irrigation, without impacting groundwater and surface water quality. So we're going to put lysimeters and moisture meters underneath these fields. So, and as well as monitoring wells to make sure that we know that if water is getting into the groundwater, we know the quality of that water and can predict the quality of that water based on how much water we're applying to the land. And those soil moisture meters also tell us when we're starting to saturate those areas. And we can get into, the science of some of these things further, if folks want to, probably in a future conversation. We're also going to determine the ability of denitrifying bioreactors and biofilters in combination in order to determine how close we can get to drinking water standards. And objectives, like we want to see nitrate removed below 2 milligrams per liter. We'd really like to see that below 1 milligram per liter, or even less than that. And certainly a reduced pharmaceutical compounds as well. And we're talking about using two processes, both the denitrifying bioreactor and the biochar filter, to really ramp down and really reduce those compounds. So very similar to what vetiver grass is able to do. Vetiver grass is able to absorb those pollutants as well. But in this case, we would be preserving a lot of the volume of water. We wouldn't be reducing the volume very much, but that water could then be available for farmers or others that need it, particularly in West Maui, where there's a water shortage, and even Kanapali Coffee Farm, where we're doing some work. They have real limitations on water, and a lot of concerns about water because of the water system there has been impacted both by drought, but also by some maintenance issues or maintenance challenges associated with that historical system. The last thing, we're going to determine the ability of the modified SAT basin to reduce the volume and improve the quality of treated discharge in a shallow constructed basin. So we're going to construct all these things on this site in a much smaller form than they would have to be to solve the problem of, say, 3 to 5 million gallons a day. But what we're going to be able to do is predict our sizing and understand okay, how big would this practice need to be to treat 3 to 5 million gallons a day? What would the cost be? What would the maintenance be? All those, and really have those actual numbers for Kihei, and the unique environment that you have in Kihei. We have around 10 inches of rain and a lot of evapotranspiration, a lot of wind. So the ability of these nature-based practices to work in Kihei is really strong. The same with West Maui, actually, and the same with Kahului. All these practices work very well in this type of environment. So the next steps are monitoring, again, determinative land area that might be needed for these various practices, the cost of the practices, and then reporting back to the county and also reporting back to stakeholders. And just the last thing here is just some relevant literature. There are things that show that wastewater is removed by wood chip derived biochar. Denitrifying bioreactors are very effective at removing nitrate loads. Other types of things, and I'm happy to share more literature and other things if people are interested in some of these topics.
Okay. Hey, do you mind if I ask you a couple of questions about the modified sap basin?
Sure.
So you mentioned sand, and we've heard on the news there's potentially a global sand shortage. So how would that impact the use of sand in the modified sap basin?
Yeah, so yeah, I mean, what we've found, and this is some work that we've talked to University of Hawaii about, is that we can use sand alternatives. So we can use natural materials from Maui that are already, that are readily available, and we'll be able to get the same. A lot of times we're trying to convert ammonia that may be coming in from the system to nitrate, so then it can be treated by, say, the wood chip bioreactor. And so anyway, we're able to use basalt, which, again, is commonly available in Maui and relatively inexpensive. I think that's another thing that we try to do when we come up with these practices. You try to use value engineering, and you also try to use local materials and waste materials rather than pristine materials that have a larger carbon footprint or have to be shipped from Canada like sand would be. So we always try to come up with solutions wherever we are that fit that location, that fit that area, and can be constructed using local materials. It doesn't really make sense to ship stuff around the world to use nature-based solutions. They're all in front of us. Yeah.
And there is not yet a modified sap basin on Maui. That's in the plans, but it has not been constructed. Is that correct?
Yeah, so we still have to construct. We've already started so this summer the modified SAT basin and the denitrifying bioreactor will be constructed, and we'll start testing. We were able to get a little bit of a running start on the Vetiver system. So we're a few months in on that, but we're just getting started with construction this summer with those other two practices, and then we'll be monitoring them for at least 12, another 12 months to really kind of prove the consistent efficacy of those practices. And certainly with the Vetiver practices, they take a little time to 6 months, 12 months to really get that Vetiver 100% established.
Mm-hmm. Here's an interesting thought. Can you use sand made from recycled glass?
That should work. We've talked to Dr. Babcock from University of Hawaii about that, and we think that there's a really good possibility of that. Dr. Babcock was like, basically almost anything will work that's kind of an aggregate, or so I think there's a lot of options around that. In a lot of places, they are using recycled glass instead of sand in these types of practices, in stormwater treatment practices. I haven't seen them specifically used in, say, a biochar and sand filter or something, but we expect them to act in a way very much similar to sand. I mean, they're both silica, or silica as part of the basis
Mhm.
of that.
Okay. So there was a comment / question about how our local government went to the Supreme Court on the injection well issue. When it appears that there are some better natural solutions, were any of these proposed before, or do you have thoughts on this?
I can jump in on this. I know the West Maui situation is a very complex issue, and the Brown and Caldwell study also found that land application would be a great way to dispose of their own R1 water. But currently the infrastructure isn't there, and the county doesn't actually own land of that size around the wastewater facility. So hopefully, this pilot study that we do can help, inspire them to look to this alternative. And maybe in the future, once all the water infrastructure is there, then they can take a real serious look at applying some kind of land-based solutions like this.
Okay. Well, we just had another sand question pop up, so I guess we'll stick on sand for a minute. How long is the sand in the basin expected to last, and when would it need to be replaced?
Because the water coming into it, the R1 water coming into it is very clean and doesn't have a lot of sediment in it. We expect the sand to last a long time. I think, it's difficult to say if it's 20 years, 30 years, 40 years, but I think we anticipate that being able to last for a long time because of the cleanliness, essentially, of the R1 water.
Okay. There's a question. I hope I'm going to get this right. It says, does discharge also happen during storm events? I'm assuming this is on the vetiver grass. Does it have the potential to increase runoff?
Let me think. I don't really quite understand the question. So they're asking if stormwater is released during
well, I'm thinking if you're discharging wastewater to Vitavir or any of these systems, does that continue? Do you continue to do that discharge during storm events? Does it have potential to, I guess, exceed its system and increase runoff? And Larry, you can type in some more details to that question if you'd like.
No, I don't think so. If there was a storm event, then the system can be, quickly shut down, so you're not irrigating during a storm event.
Okay.
Yep.
The vetiver won't be harmed by doing that, and at that point, the vetiver will be mature, and it has a high water use rate. So even if it's storming, the chances of any runoff are minimized. And also, when we do plant vetiver, we like to plant it on the slope contour. So if there is any runoff, it'll hit the row of vetiver and spread evenly on the contour rather than flowing down slope in a concentrated manner. That creates volume and velocity, and that's where erosion starts. So just the style alone in which vetiver is planted and its ability to really use a lot of water, even in highly saturated situations, I don't believe there'll be any problem during a storm event.
Okay. There was a kind of a similar question that came in earlier about would you plant vetiver and secondary gulches around the wastewater treatment plant to help reduce stormwater from upcountry agriculture?
Yeah, and I think that's a great point. That's kind of the premise behind decentralizing these reuse areas. If there's areas along this the current existing recycled water line that would benefit from some erosion control from these upcountry storm events, it'd be a great benefit. We can use the site to stop sediment and soil from reaching South Kihei Road, and at the same time increase the county's reuse goal. And for me, like I said earlier, it's feeding two birds with one seed. You're solving two problems with one application tool for the most part.
Okay. So we have a question. The water being used is county treated effluent, not wastewater, correct? The same quality that is being used at parks and golf courses currently. This is to solve the problem of not enough willing end users.
Correct. Yes.
Okay. And then once sand or plants become saturated with filtered chemicals and need to be replaced, how would this material be disposed of?
Yeah, I think that's a really long time horizon. And the other thing is that some of these things are in low enough concentrations that we don't necessarily expect them to bioaccumulate. And so I think part of what we have to think about with a question like that are, what are the treatment mechanisms that are removing those pollutants? So one of the treatment mechanisms, yes, is absorption into a plant or absorption into biochar or into a wood chip. But there's also, when we make the proper environment for bacteria that break down chemicals and break down other living things, and even things like mycorrhizal fungi, that's their job in nature, is to break down pollutants and contaminants, then you don't have bioaccumulation. And so by using multiple means of treatment, particularly bacteria, even looking at mycorrhizal fungi, we won't have the buildup of, even in the root zone of, say, vetiver grass or other plants, you have root exudates that essentially are habitat for bacteria. And so again, I think part of it is understanding the full set of treatment mechanisms and trying to ensure that we don't get in situations that we have bioaccumulation of pollutants. And so from what we've seen, even in these types of systems where they're treating runoff from highways that have a lot of PAHs and other nasty contaminants, you tend not, they don't, the plants coming from those tend not to bioaccumulate it so much that they have to be disposed of as like hazardous waste or in a landfill or like in a special landfill. So again, I think, but those are things that, 20, 30 years out, those are, I think things that we would want to make sure, but the evidence so far in literature, particularly in stormwater literature, which is going to be dirtier than this, there's not a lot of evidence that says that these are low level, problematic wastes.
There was a question that came up earlier that I thought was interesting. If you were talking about a very, very large field of vetiver grass, is there any risk to cattle or other animals that might wander in and eat the grass?
I don't think so. From my experience, it's non-palatable to cattle. The access deer don't even eat it. And, at the site in Kihei, we have plenty of deer that come through there. There's a lot of evidence from scat and footprints, and they don't touch the grass. The blades are a bit stiff and upright, and I feel like it may be a little too sharp for some ungulates. The only animals that I have seen eat it are goats, and even then, they're a bit particular about it. In terms of animal, I think the best use I've seen for the vetiver is as bedding. Once you prune it and dry it, it makes excellent bedding for animals. But in terms of kind of negative impacts or any kind of feeding or browsing damage, I don't think the grass will be affected, and I don't think any animals would be affected as well.
Is there any other biomass use? Does the vetiver have to be cut periodically? And is there,
Just to maintain the life and health of the plant, I would recommend at least an annual pruning. Typically, the biomass is used as mulch. It's also used as bedding, like I had said. It actually is a great way to sequester carbon. And once you cut and mulch it right on the ground, it makes a great feedstock for soil microbiome and soil fungi. So you start creating a healthy soil and root zone area, which then enhances the ability for the whole system to take up nutrients and really treat the wastewater.
okay. A question just came in. Why don't we grow something more useful with the reuse water, i.e. animal food, etc.?
Yeah, that can be done. I think in this instance, we feel Vitavir is a great candidate because of its ability to, take up a lot of wastewater. Other grasses that are used for feed, like I was talking earlier, have a cessation period. So you don't have that ability to irrigate at high volumes year round. With Vetiver, you can. And if it's a matter of, creating a food product from this reuse, there has been in studies of people using the prunings to grow mushrooms. So, that's something that we had discussed and possibly, might look into for the future.
Okay.
Yeah, I want to answer that too. I think that it would take a lot more acres and so with the price of land in Maui and everything else, we might be talking about 200, 300, 400 acres. So it may take a lot of acres. And again, I could see, yes, potentially for using some of that for animals, but also again, it's all also about cost benefit. What's the cost and what's the benefit of that versus. So again, we all know how expensive land is here in Maui. So that could be a hard sell.
Mm-hmm. There was a question that came up, and it's very similar to what was asked. And there's been a couple that I've skipped over that are very similar, but it kind of gives me a feeling that there's not quite the level of understanding here. And it's about, you mentioned you treat the recycled water with Vitavir, and then that would proceed to be used for irrigation. But my understanding is you are using the wastewater on Vitavir, and the plant is absorbing all of that. It's not then used for irrigation. Can you clarify that? Do I have that right?
Yeah. So in the case of land disposal that John talked about,
Mm-hmm.
yes, it's being there's very little that would even go into the groundwater, and what would go into the groundwater would be sufficiently cleaned up by the root system and the vetiver grass itself. And then um, in terms of the SAT basin, again, we're cleaning up water and then we're allowing it to pass into the groundwater, which we do need groundwater recharge. That's important. That's an important component of things. And then with the second thing that I talked about, the denitrifying bioreactor and the biofilter, that is where we preserve the volume. And so someplace like West Maui, where the farmers, Kanapali Coffee Company and other places there need water, that solution might work well in West Maui, where that water is really desirable. And especially if we can get rid of those pharmaceutical compounds and those other things to a large degree, then it would be fair game. Get it close to drinking water.
Mm-hmm.
Then that would be fair game to use it in coffee and food production
Right.
versus, yeah.
Well, we could go on. It's such an interesting topic. I've actually gone on a little too long with questions. Sorry about that. But I just wanted to thank you, Paul and John, so much. It's such an interesting topic, and best of luck with your 3 different ways that you're going to be looking at to treat wastewater. So it's very exciting news for all of us as we look for ways to purify Maui's wastewater to protect our nearshore ocean, water quality, and coral reefs. We thank our audience for attending this Know Your Ocean speaker series hosted by Maui Nui Marine Resource Council, a nonprofit organization celebrating 14 years of working for clean ocean water, healthy coral reefs, and abundant native fish for the islands of Maui Nui. Our next Know Your Ocean speaker series event will take place on Wednesday, July 7th at 5:30 on Zoom. Our topic will be education versus enforcement, going on beyond the enactment of Hawaii's sunscreen law. We'll have a panel discussion, including a very special guest, Dr. Craig Downs, the scientist who is instrumental in bringing forth the evidence that oxybenzone and, oh boy, I'm going to skip that, are harmful to our coral reefs.
Oxybenzone.
Thank you. Which led, I should have put my glasses on, which led to the enactment of Hawaii's sunscreen law, which went into effect on January 1 of this year. What educational outreach and enforcement efforts are underway to make sure the public complies with this new law, and what new laws are needed to protect our reefs from sunscreen pollution? Be sure to join us for this important panel discussion. To get news about our upcoming events, sign up for Maui Nui Marine Resource Council's free monthly e-newsletter, Reef and Brief, at mauireefs.org. And you can view our past Know Your Ocean speaker series presentations on Maui Nui Marine Resource Council's YouTube page at Maui Reefs. Tonight's presentation can also be viewed and shared on Facebook. Please let your friends know so that they can listen to environmental presentations like this one Sunday mornings at 9 a.m. on the Island Environment 360 show on all Hawaii media radio stations. Maui Nui Marine Resource Council is proud to present our Know Your Ocean speaker series as part of our work to educate the public about issues relating to our marine environment. Other projects include ocean water quality monitoring along Maui's leeward shores, visitor education programs, the oyster bioremediation project to improve ocean water quality in Maalaea Bay, efforts to reduce sediment runoff from the Po'okea watershed into Maalaea Bay, a limu isotope study, and new pesticide education project to encourage Maui landscapers, homeowners, and property owners to switch away from synthetic fertilizers, pesticides, and herbicides that are harmful to coral reefs. This work is made possible with the support of people like you. Please donate to Maui Nui Marine Resource Council at mauireefs.org. And when you do, you can choose a free thank you gift, including some great swag. And we should also mention that Maui Nui Marine Resource Council is a 501c3 organization, so your donation is U.S. tax deductible to the extent allowed by law. Thank you again to all of the businesses and organizations that sponsor Maui Nui Marine Resource Council. And thank you, our audience, for joining us tonight and our special presenters who were so wonderful. We hope to see you next month. Mahalo, everyone.
Thank you.